we're lucky enough to have Sheila Jeffries speaking, Linda Bellos, and Renate Klein, who will talk about the book and how great it is, and also talk about the events of the book, some of what happened in the 70s, 1970s and 80s, and all the time up to today. So, trigger warning, My Feminist Life. It's an engaging autobiography, a fascinating account of feminist history, from the heady days of women's liberation movements through to the backlash against radical feminism as neoliberal laissez-faire attitudes took hold. Fast forward to the current re-examination of feminism in light of the Me Too movement and an emerging new wave of radical feminism. What is this book about, and why is the title Trigger Warning?
Well, the book is an autobiography, and some people might think, well, she must be up herself. Why is she wanting to write an autobiography? Who does she think she is? Well, the situation is that I love autobiographies. I read them all the time because I find that a really good way of understanding the times that somebody has gone through. And I wanted to write about these times because a new wave of feminism is arising now, but many young women in particular have absolutely no idea what was happening at that time. They have no idea we had this huge movement and that it was so exciting. 2 years ago, I wrote a book called The Lesbian Revolution, which was an academic book which talked about, which interviewed women and talked about the politics of what was happening to show the extraordinary lesbian revolution, as I called it, that was happening at that time. But I couldn't write about myself and my own experience in that. It had to be an academic book. And of course, I lived through all of that. I have some actually quite interesting anecdotes about what all of that was about. So I wanted to write a book where I could actually give my own account. And I do hope that having written The Lesbian Revolution and this one, that I've contributed to the history of lesbian feminism, radical feminism as a movement. It's a worry to me that other radical feminists are not writing autobiographies. Some socialist feminists have written autobiographies, some liberal feminists have written autobiographies, but radical feminists have not. So can I say right now, please do so. Don't be modest. Write your autobiographies because it's a really important way of getting that history onto the map. The book is called Trigger Warning because the sort of analysis of sexuality that we developed as radical and revolutionary feminists back in the day is now seen as extraordinarily rude and unacceptable and inappropriate, which is an extraordinary situation to have reached. And I was aware a few years ago that my book Anti-Climax, which was published in 1990 and talked about how the so-called sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s was actually a very big problem for women because it just made women accessible to all that men wanted to do and so on. That book at the time got quite a lot of very positive attention. And yet a few years ago online, I saw that some young person had said that book was so alarming that you needed a trigger warning for it. It's just a book saying what was in various sexological works. So what has happened in the last few years is the feminism has come to be seen as dangerous and alarming in and of itself. And so I thought, yep, that's the title for the book, Trigger Warning, My Lesbian Feminist Life, because at many points in my lesbian feminist life, I, or my work, has been seen as too dangerous, and I've been excluded or shunned or whatever, just because all of the stuff that I've done has been seen as too dangerous. And basically, what the book does is describe the fact that I think my main contribution has been, as part of other radical and revolutionary feminists back in the day, and now unfortunately often on my own, creating an analysis of sexuality and male sexuality, an analysis of male sexuality as social control of women, an analysis of the fact that sexuality under male supremacy is constructed to be the eroticizing of women's equality very specifically, which is exciting to men, and unfortunately very often it forms the basis of what women find exciting about sex as well. Because of course sexuality is fundamentally not something natural, it's socially constructed, and it's socially constructed from the subordination of women and men's power. So what I've tried to do all of my life, and I've carried this through, is talk about how we need to create, if there's to be any liberation or future for women of freedom, then we have to eroticize equality. So that's really what my life has been about, I think. During the 70s and 80s, this analysis was reasonably well known. But in the 90s, of course, and starting in the 1980s, there was a huge fight back from male supremacy. There was a development of a movement, sadomasochism. There was a fight back from gay men who created queer politics. Because, of course, that understanding that sex must be changed is seen as hugely frightening to male supremacy.
So the next question I'd like to ask you is, I'll just say this, I've read the book and it's fantastic. I've got a copy here and it is really highly recommended. It's a different read from some of your other books, Sheila, because it's easier. It's more of a sort of holiday. You just want to find out what happened next, and then where did you go and live next, and who were you hanging out with, and what happened next. So it's a completely different read. So it's a brilliant way to get a different form of insight. And it's very enjoyable. Although, of course, all your other books I've found very enjoyable. So my question is, did your early years in Malta and London influence your feminist life?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I always want to think, how was somebody when they were a child? Is it in any way connected to the politics they develop? And I can only say that I was a very obstinate and feisty little child, it's fair to say. When I came back from Malta when I was 10 years old and went to a primary school in Britain, my class teacher wanted me to call him sir because all the kids were expected to call him sir for some reason. I wasn't used to that. In my school in Malta, my teacher was called Mr. Laws and I called him Mr. Laws. So I said to this teacher, no, I'm not going to call you sir. And he made me kneel in the middle of the classroom until I was prepared to call him sir. Well, I never did do that, of course. And eventually he had to let me get up and go back to my seat. So it's fair to say that I was a very, very obstinate child. And of course, I do think I'm a very, very obstinate person now. It's reasonable to say. But in terms of traveling around, because of course I was in Malta as a child, then I lived in London as a child. And in my adult life, I moved to America for a year, and then of course I moved to Australia. I do think that moving around has been quite important to me. Going to Australia, for instance, made me an internationalist, because in Australia, politics is very international. When I left Britain to go to Australia, British feminism was not very international. It wasn't, there were not many connections made, even into Europe at that time. So I think Australia, being in Australia, was very, very important to me in widening my scope. And of course, I taught international feminist politics and so on.
You described being a radical or a revolutionary feminist in the 1970s and 80s. What were the best bits and the worst bits of that?
Well, being a radical, in fact, a revolutionary feminist was what I called myself at that time. In the 1970s and 80s, the best bit, of course, was the politics and becoming a lesbian. The politics was so extraordinarily exciting. Finding women exciting was very exciting as well. It was a world of our own, because, of course, I got rid of the men in my life in 1977 and going to everything that was women only, theatre and conferences and discos, and being with other women was the most exciting thing. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of us involved, and thousands and thousands and thousands of women becoming lesbians at that time. There was a ferment of excitement, which is very difficult now to describe. So really having all of that world of women. And of course, the politics were tremendously exciting. We thought we'd change the world. We actually thought at one point that the best way to change the world quite quickly was for everyone, all women, to become lesbians. And how could we persuade them to do that? Because then women would be withdrawing their labours from men all over the world, and change would have to come. And then we had serious conversations about whether men would get the guns out. They probably would have, and what would we do about that? But it was a very, very exciting time, and it was a hopeful time as well, because it was a time of dramatic social change. So then that changed. And so in the 80s, there was the development of a movement of sadomasochism, which came from gay men originally, in particular, was picked up by some lesbians in the States and brought to Britain. And that was an enormous shock to us because, of course, we have been enjoying and writing about and appreciating having a sexuality of equality with other women. It didn't occur to us that there would be some women who'd want to continue the sadomasochist romance of heterosexuality with other women. So it was in the 1980s that began to come over from the States, and we became aware of books promoting sadomasochism. And that was a kind of heartbreak, realizing that that could happen, because we had thought we were all gung-ho to create the revolution, eroticize equality, and create a new world. So in response to that, we started writing about and fighting sadomasochism and campaigning against it. It really was the biggest threat to the continuation of feminism in the 1980s. And by the end of the 1980s, that sadomasochism was very powerful indeed. And, you know, the discos and women's events had to work out whether they were going to have a dress code, because the sadomasochists used Nazi symbolism, even swastikas. So by the 1990s, there was a huge, the backlash was huge, and it was really affecting us at the same time as the ideas were, I suppose, reaching the peak of their power. So those were the extraordinarily good bits and the bad bits. But even when the bad bits were happening in the 1990s, we had our sisters. You know, there were hundreds of us working together and fighting this together. That ceased to be the case at the end of the 1980s. And the power of the backlash against us was so great that, you know, feminists were scattering from about sort of 1988 on to 1990. And so I was not unhappy at all to move to Australia in 1991, because things were not as they were.
Linda and Sheila were involved in the struggles around paedophilia and sadomasochism together, and also in WAVOR together.
Linda and I were both in Women Against Violence Against Women in London, which was an incredibly dynamic organisation which had about 40 women in it. And Linda, we were struggling at that time against the normalisation of paedophilia, had been for some years. And I remember an occasion when Linda and I went to a gay workshop, it was called, I think organised by Gay Left, and it was on paedophilia. So we decided that we would go and oppose it, as we used to at the time. And the thing I remember most about that workshop is that there was a middle-aged Dutch paedophile there, because paedophilia very much had its birthplace in the Netherlands. And there was a young man, probably about 19 years old, and the Dutch paedophile spoke about how paedophilia was absolutely fine and the kids loved it and it was all great. And the 19-year-old man was very, very brave. He stood up and he said, "You sound and are just like my abuser." It was a very, very powerful moment, because Linda and I had both spoken, and I think it was the fact that we'd put a feminist analysis out there that allowed this young man, gave him the courage to be able to actually say what his experience had been. I wish there was more of that now, but unfortunately there isn't. About the sadomasochism struggle, I have already said quite a bit, and I know that Linda at that time wrote very powerfully about sadomasochism and made connections between racism and sadomasochism and so on. So I think really it's over to Linda on this one.
The principles were being bold enough to, and we did, Sheila and I were prepared to engage and be hostile and critical of a politics which we were being encouraged through. It was lesbian and gay, or gay and lesbian, and I think they were trying to suggest to us that somehow the abuse of women, the abuse of children was revolutionary. I was then, and actually still am, a mother. I had young children, and there's absolutely no way that they could give me an argument that would justify sexual abuse of children. And I did, and I continue to view it in a similar way as I view racism, which is about white men's power. They thought that they could own all of us. Physically, they had owned us as enslaved peoples. They enslaved women, they enslaved children, and I wasn't prepared to do nothing about it or merely complain. I was prepared to engage and to make clear to many of them what I felt and what I knew they were doing, which was wrong. They tried to make it sound revolutionary, and what it was simply abuse of children in the name of sex, in the name of liberation. And I thought it was, I think it is wrong, and I will, as I'm sure other feminists will, confront it wherever we can. But it isn't a positive politics. That was what was being sold at the time. It wasn't a positive politics then, and it isn't now.
Sheila, you wrote your first book, The Spinster and Her Enemies, in your 30s. Why did you not develop an academic life in the UK? And what was it like being a feminist in academia?
Yes, well, I started wanting to be in academia in the late 70s. I went up to Bradford to do a PhD in 1978 on the sexual abuse of children in the home. I thought what is often euphemistically called incest was an enormously important issue. And when I went up to Bradford and started doing some research, I found that actually there'd been a huge feminist campaign against this, leading to a 1908 Punishment of Incest Act in the previous wave of feminism. And that was really interesting to me because I was a historian. So I changed my tack and got into the history, which became Spinster and Her Enemies. By the late 1980s, I was trying to get a job in academia. The Spinster and Her Enemies was out. It was well received. And I thought, I could apply for jobs. But it became very clear to me, that other women who didn't have books and were not well known were getting jobs that I applied for. I was getting little slips of paper saying, thank you very much applying, but we had many applications. So gradually the message was sinking in that there was no way I was going to get an academic job in Britain. That's basically how it was. I was well known, I was being written about in various places, but I was well known in the wrong way. I did not suit the academic politics of Britain, and they wanted safer, more liberal lesbians and feminists to get jobs. So the extraordinary thing for me was that in 1990, I saw this advertisement for a job in University of Melbourne, which said they wanted someone for a 3 to 5 year position to do gender, sexuality and feminism. And I thought, I can do that. So I applied for this job and did the interview on my phone in my hallway, in my pajamas, because there was a bit of a time difference. And indeed, I was asked by the head of department who interviewed me at the time, did I think that sexual intercourse, now more usually we refer to this as penis in vagina sex, was inevitably oppressive. And of course, I wanted the job. So I probably hedged at that time and didn't just say, yes, of course, and explain the ways in which it was. So I did get the job, and that's why I went to Australia. And it was going to be 3 to 5 years, but actually I managed to get that extended. The interesting thing is when I went to get a sort of permanency, the head of department, I am told by others, a different head of department, said that the problem with all the stuff I did on sexuality and stuff was that really I was probably a journalist, not an academic. And this has always been an anxiety that I have had throughout my years of writing. I'm not really properly academic. There's something a bit wrong. Basically, I think I'm too interesting. I think that's the problem. What I write about is really, really interesting, and therefore it must be journalism. It can't possibly be academic. So that's how I ended up being in Australia all of that time. I think in the earlier years I might have come back, but I didn't think there was any chance that I'd be employed in Britain. Whereas in Australia, they loved that I published 2 books that were already being taught in women's studies at that university. So for them, I was a catch, whereas in Britain, I was just too over the top.
So Linda, you've read the book. What do you like about the book, Trigger Warning, and why do you think women might want to read it?
Well, it's the first account of that time that I have seen anywhere. There are things that I found out in the book that I didn't know. Given that actually, and Sheila hasn't mentioned this, we were lovers for a while, a short while, and we've been in and out of friendship over the last 30 years. Always about politics. I like the fact that although it's Sheila's account of her life, it's informative. Young women who don't know and have no access to a really radical politics that we were involved in have at last a chance to find out what it was. They don't have to agree, but it's there, because all of the other books, and you and Sheila have already said it, but some of the gobbledygook that I sometimes reading, Judith, whatever her name is, I think, yes, it's Butler, I kind of know. It feels like it was written in Serbo-Croat and translated into Icelandic, because I can't read a bloody word of it. Why not? It's meant to be in English. Plain English would do. Sheila's book does that. It was a revelation. It was actually, Sheila, I was quoted too many times, but nonetheless, I found it informative, that really seriously the process, and here's a record. So often as we were then revolutionary feminists, we now call ourselves radical feminists, but we have been written out of history, and here Sheila puts us back into that history, and Sheila's role in it is, in my view, central.
What about, Linda, your experience of being a radical or as was then a revolutionary feminist in the 70s and 80s? What were the best bits and worst bits for you?
Oh, the worst bit, I must say, was losing custody of my children. Anyway, I didn't get custody back, but my children came to live with me later, so let's park that one. The best bits were an understanding, using my Marxist analysis to look at that thing called gender, the power that men had over women, having the role of men's violence against women as the means by which they kept us in check. I think having applying my Marxist analysis to the relationship between men and women was absolutely vital. I can't think of nobody has presented to me, or I've not read of any other explanation to the worldwide phenomena of men's violence against women. And feminism is the only place that I have seen such an analysis. And what Sheila's book and revolutionary feminism did was to put us into the agency, owning our own agency to do something about it, not merely to complain about it, or we weren't just in groups being supportive of each other. We were doing something about men's violence against women, and that remains with me. And I must say that I left, well, the women's liberation movement was consumed in the late 90s and thereafter by sadomasochism and more. It got worse and worse and worse, and thankfully we're now beginning to re-embrace our feminism, and that's absolutely bloody wonderful.
It comes up in the book that Sheila joined the Labour Party for a while and had some contact. Some politicians sort of approached her and asked her if she wanted to become further involved in a political parties. But you actually were very involved in the Labour Party. And
yes.
Can you tell us about what that was like, and also the links that you had with the feminist movement, how that worked?
Well, I joined, I was encouraged to join black sections of the Labour Party. I didn't join the Labour Party proper, as it were. Black sections were a part of the Labour Party, but they were, it took a long time I took a long time to be persuaded to join the blasted party, but there wasn't an active women's liberation movement. And I did, in those days, I was mid-30s, you know, I was quite young and was still politically engaged. And so I joined black sections, and I think I hope I brought to it my feminist critique. Not only, there was issues about how I could sort of park those, because the Labour Party had ways of doing things. And I wasn't so worried about the whether you have a caucus and whether you put resolutions in this place or that place. What I brought, I hope, to my role as I became vice chair of black sections of the Labour Party at its first AGM, and I brought, I hope, to it some of the honesty that feminism had insisted upon, and I got persuaded to stand for roles in the Labour Party. I really didn't want to be a councillor, but you know, it happened. Somewhere where I live, the councillor, the white man who was standing, he resigned, and I got persuaded to stand, and I won. And I can't remember when I got outed as a dyke, but it didn't do me any harm, evidently. And then later, soon after, when Ted Knight and other Labour councillors were surcharged and disqualified, I was a councillor, and I was encouraged to put myself forward, and I put myself forward, and I was elected leader of the council. And it would be fair to say that the Daily Mail and other newspapers of standing didn't like me. Like, that's an insult. I would have been insulted if they'd liked me. So that's what I you know, I did what I could as a black out lesbian.
You were quite influential, I think, in the GLC, the Greater London Council.
Yeah.
That was when
Yeah.
the Labour sort of progressive, at that time, part of the Labour Party took over the running of London. Can you tell us whether you think that was good for feminism? Do you feel that you achieved a lot?
Well, I'm not sure it was good for feminism. I'm not sure, because it wasn't really desperate. It was pro-women, but it wasn't feminist in the way that I understood feminism. Nonetheless, I mean, I did join. It was a job, and it was actually, it was about equality amongst women. That was good, and that was, I think, the first council that did that, that recognised that women aren't a homogenous mass, that there was actually class, and I hate the word race, but racism that to be counted, and disability, and I was team leader of the equalities group within the women's unit, within the GLC, so very complicated, but I brought my feminism to my role. I wasn't well loved by especially those women who thought that, I don't know what they thought what feminism was. I think they thought it was just for white women. I think they just thought it was about them being able to get better jobs, and I didn't have that view. I really did think that we should do things which were about all women and recognise and do something about race, class, disability in the category of women. So that's what I tried to do, and I think I wasn't very well liked by the Daily Mail, which I must say is an accolade.
So I want to go to bring Sheila in at that stage. So that was when you were still in London, and you were very active, as I understand it, at a similar time when Linda was active in the Labour Party and in Lambeth Council, leader of Lambeth Council in the GLC. What was happening for you, Sheila, at that time in terms of your politics and your life?
This was late or mid-1980s. We're talking about mid-1980s?
Yeah.
I think I was very briefly in the Labour Party at that time. It was nothing to do with feminism. I think I was in the women's group of the local Labour Party in Putney. I mean, you know, the sort of feminism that I and originally Linda were involved in would have been like a bomb going off in those meetings. I mean, there was just no way to begin for those people to understand what we were doing.
Yeah.
So I just tried to be sort of polite and pleasant in the women's group in the Labour Party and gave up after a while. But obviously, my feminism comes from the left. You know, in the 60s, when I was at university, I was reading all the left-wing books and doing political theory, and I came from socialist feminism. In the early 1970s, I was in socialist feminism, and then I came across to revolutionary feminism. So I have to say that in the mid-80s, when Linda was doing all that stuff in the Labour Party, and I can understand her priorities and why she wanted to do that, the left was not something that I or most of the women I knew, the organised left, something we had anything to do with at all, because we saw them as pretty hostile. We would go to marches and there'd be all these Socialist Workers' Party banners, and it would be absolutely infuriating, and then trying to tell us what to do and so on. I can remember conferences where the Communist Party, I was quite attracted to the Communist Party at the time, I have to say. It was when B. Campbell was in the Communist Party, and it all seemed quite, you know, there was a slight feminist edge to it. And I can remember meetings where, you know, the Communist Party women would all be organised in different parts of the room trying to get their view across, or Wages for Housework, which was another lefty group. It was very difficult for us as radical feminists because they were so organised, you know, they had the people in the different bits of the room, and they had a position paper. We didn't have position papers, actually. So no, I had nothing to do with the left at that time, the organised left, apart from about a year in the Labour Party. In terms of the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats were formed from some people in the Labour Party and the Liberals at the time, because I had been a young Liberal talking about abortion when I was 14 in Twickenham, Young Liberals. I was being headhunted to become a Lib Dem, or SDLP as it was called that time, MP. And I can remember being in Bayswater saying to Lord Kennet, no, I couldn't, because I was from the Labour Party. I was always voted Labour, and I always would all my life, which is reasonably true. So no, I didn't join the Lib Dems either. But no, I had nothing to do with the sort of organised left that Linda was battling away in at that time.
In the book you mentioned this, that you both sort of had some, well, the London Lesbian and Gay Centre was set up in that time, and that could have been a good thing for lesbians. But what do you think happened with that? And I guess you two might have been there together, or been to events there, or did you just, that wasn't a place that you found helpful or your home? If we go to Linda first, Linda, what do you remember of the?
What I remember of was the growth effectively of S&M politics. I did support it, and at the beginning there was women's space. All of those things after the GLC was abolished in what was that, March 1986. After it wasn't much. A couple of years after it was dead. But there was an increasing influence of the S&M politics, and I went less and less. And there weren't many places, but there were because places were shutting down. The women's spaces, the social spaces for women were shutting down. So I and a number other women did go there, but we did so increasingly less.
Yeah. How about you, Sheila?
A woman who was involved in the Lesbian and Gay Centre when it was set up, there was a lot of GLC money in it, so it was important in that sense. There was a whole floor for lesbians, which was amazing. But of course, the GLC had no understanding that lesbians and gay men have completely different politics, completely different priorities, because gay men are part of the ruling class of men and so on. So there was actually not anything in common, which of course something like the Labour Party and the GLC couldn't begin to acknowledge. So yes, a friend of mine was involved in the setting of that up, and she became aware very quickly that the sadomasochist dykes were looking to get space on the lesbian floor. So we set up LASM, Lesbians Against Sadomasochism, to fight this. And we would go to meetings at the Lesbian and Gay Centre in 85, particularly trying to stop it. What happened was that they had an extraordinary general meeting to discuss it. We tried to get as many lesbians there as possible, and we got them to bring their kids, because one of the arguments we were making was, if everybody's wearing leather and handcuffs and swastikas, this is not a very good atmosphere, and lesbians have to be able to bring their children without seeing sadomasochism. So there were a lot of kids, and I think some of the gay men were quite cross about the kids there, but basically the gay men completely outnumbered us. They voted for sadomasochism, as did the therapists. The feminist therapists, because they had terribly liberal politics, they voted for anything goes, so they wanted kids to have to be confronted with the swastikas. That was completely fine for them. So they ratted on us, and it passed by a small number. And I think those lesbian therapists, feminist therapists, so-called, were probably crucial to that number. So after that, we girl-cotted the Lesbian and Gay Centre entirely. We had absolutely nothing to do with it. But it was a terrible loss, because in theory there was that whole women's floor and that whole women's space.
You were, you're sort of firstly a feminist, it seems, as is Sheila, but you spent quite a lot of time in the Labour Party. What do you think now? Do you think you're more interested in feminist politics or in the Labour Party politics? Where are you sort of working most now these days, Linda?
I'm still a member of the Labour Party. I do bugger all. What's there to do? I continue to be, and have continued to be, a feminist, a lesbian feminist. Not just I'm not the kind of feminist who thinks that a man putting on a dress becomes a woman, and that has happened in the Labour Party. I'm anti-trans, a socialist, a Marxist even, and definitely a lesbian feminist in terms of labels. And if I go through all my black involvement, we'd be here for a long time. So it's not an either or for me. I'm a lesbian, I'm a feminist, and there's not a competition. What we need is a politics that is capable of creating a world in which power is not used by men to dominate women, children, the world. I want to see, working with other women, I want to see a better world. And if we do nothing, we are going to get more of the idiot who is currently the President of the United States.
Renate, what do you like about the book, and why do you think women would want to read it?
Hello, everybody. Hello, Joe, and hello, Linda and Sheila and everybody else. I think it's a fabulous book. I mean, I've lived rather closely with this book now when we were editing it. And I have to say, Sheila was actually the perfect author. She mostly agreed to the changes we suggested. So she was really, really good to work with. Not that there was a lot of changes to be made, because the book is actually really well written and it's a fantastic read. Now, I think everybody should read it, but particularly I think young women should read it, and especially those women who think they probably might be lesbians, but they don't have the courage in this time, you know, where they should transition, become trans, you know, trans boys. They don't have the courage to call themselves lesbian. And I think it is just totally wonderful to read Sheila's book. And there is one chapter that is titled Choosing to be a Lesbian. And it's fantastic to actually see that many of us, you know, really chose to be lesbians. I don't actually use the word choose very often because it's totally misused. I don't use it for abortion, for instance, because I don't think abortion is choice. It's a difficult decision, and yes, we have to have it, but I wouldn't call it a choice. A choice is between chocolate cake and a lemon tart, both really very wonderful. But I do actually use it for choosing. I mean, I choose to be a lesbian, and it's the best decision in my whole life. And so I just wish, especially for young women, to read this book and to say, oh, really? Can you be a lesbian? Can you choose a lesbian to be a lesbian? So I think that's one of the best things. The other thing that I think is fantastic about Sheila's book is it shows that, yes, it was really possible to have consciousness raising groups, to have meetings, yes, to have disagreements, but we talk through them. There was a lot of action happening in the 70s and still the 80s. And that today, especially when everything is online, or so much is online, and even before the COVID-19. So young women should read the book. All women should read the book. I really had to laugh. The first review on the American Amazon, not that we want to promote Amazon, but the first review on the Amazon, which gave it 5 stars, was by a bloke called Patrick. And I read it out to Susan Hawthorne, my partner, and it was very good, and said, brilliant book, need to read it, da, da, da. I said, who is this man? I said, oh, Patrick. Yeah, he always reviews our books favorably. So there we are, Patrick, you know. So yes, the odd bloke should read it as well. I'm sure there are those few men who actually, you know, support women, support radical feminism. They will no doubt read it, hopefully review it. And so actually all of you who are now listening to this launch, which I'm really happy about, please do review the book if you can.
What was it like going to Melbourne, and what was the state of feminism and lesbianism when you got to Melbourne?
Yes, well, we left, Anne and I, from Melbourne in 1991, and we were incredibly pleasantly surprised by Melbourne. I mean, it is a very, very beautiful city, and we immediately saw parrots just flying about and so on. I mean, it was just magic in that way. But also, the state of feminism at that time was pretty good. Spinifex Press, Renate's press, set up pretty much at the same time as we moved out there. So there were lots of events happening and books being published. Renate was at Deakin University at that time, and they were running summer schools, which were pretty marvelous. So all of that was happening. That was a kind of feminist hub of action. In the street that we lived on, there was a lesbian-run cafe called The Angel. There was a lesbian bookshop and a lesbian gift shop just round, sorry, a feminist bookshop shop and a feminist gift shop just round the corner. So, and a women's gallery. I was immediately asked to speak at a women's art gallery as soon as I arrived. And we thought, it's pretty amazing. Although at the same time, in Brunswick Street, which is a kind of main street full of cafes on which we lived, there were lesbians covered in black leather and studs sitting with pit bull terriers with studded collars outside some of the cafes. And very quickly, sadomasochism entered my classroom. One sadomasochist young woman came up and asked me why I had Andrea Dworkin on my syllabus. Was it a mistake? And I hadn't realized. And I had to say, no, actually, she's on there because she's a feminist, a marvelous feminist.
Let's go to Renate. Were you in Melbourne at the time that Sheila turned up, and did she have an impact? Did it help the feminist movement or the lesbian movement?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I moved from London actually to Melbourne in 1986, and I had met Sheila in Melbourne, but I didn't really know Sheila all that well. But we were all really excited when Sheila came. Many of us had read The Spinster and Her Enemy, and it was just good to have another radical feminist amongst us. And as Sheila was saying, I was teaching women's studies at Deakin University, which is about in Geelong, which is about an hour away from Melbourne. And we had a lot of activities going on during the 90s. I was doing it together with my friend and colleague Robin Rowland, and we had summer institutes, and Sheila taught in one of those. We had lots of conferences, but Sheila also pretty quickly instituted something called the Feminist Forum, which was a get-together at Melbourne University for her students, but other academics and whoever wanted to be there. In 1991, Susan and I decided that we actually really wanted to publish books that we wanted to read, and that wasn't much around. Susan had been working at Penguin. I had already been working as an academic editor for a book series, the Athene series, which was initially with The Horrible Pergamon, but then it moved to College Teachers Press in America. And I was an editor with Janice Raymond and Gloria Bowles. And we managed to actually republish The Transsexual Empire in 1994. So we thought we had it all between us. Susan came from the fiction and poetry side, and I was the non-fiction person. And so we started, and our first book was called Angels of Power. And it was a book with stories and plays and poetry on reproductive politics. Because I've been active in England together with Jalna Hammer and many, many others, and Farida Akhtar in Bangladesh, in an organization called FinRage that probably, hopefully, some of you who are listening now know. And we were, from the early 80s, heavy critics against reproductive technologies. And of course, that also meant that we were critics against prostitution, because the two go hand in hand. You can't be a critic of one and not be a critic of others. And that also brought Sheila and me really together, because as Sheila explains in her book, Australia did not have an organization that was a women's group that was really head-on talking about the violence that is prostitution, and trying to introduce what we call the Nordic model, because it started in 1999 in Sweden, and it penalizes the buyers, the sex buyers, but not the women, and it also makes it possible that women can exit prostitution. And so anyway, we all knew Kathy Barry, who was at that point running the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women in the US. And Sheila asked her if it would be okay if we started an organization in Australia, which was linked to the coalition. And so that happened in 1994. We started the CATWA, and it is still going, despite the fact Sheila is not there. And that was really very good, because for the first time we managed to actually have an official presence in Australia talking about the harm that prostitution causes. But I also remember that when we launched Sheila's book, The Idea of Prostitution, which was published in '97, we managed to invite a prostitution survivor from America. Her name was Angel. And she came, and the experience for her was very unpleasant. And it was actually quite difficult at that time to find women who had exited prostitution and who wanted to talk about this. This is now so much better when we have survivor-led organizations, but we really had to do it quite the hard way. Actually, we wanted to do a book from Katwa, and a woman who had exited prostitution came to our meetings for quite a long time, and then she stopped coming, and we realized she'd gone back into prostitution. It was all very hard. But it was wonderful to have Sheila there. We had very good meetings from Katwa. There is a photo of the banner that we had. We went on marches. So Katwa was a really good organization, and Sheila basically made that happen. I mean, I joined very, very quickly, but it was good to do that together.
Yeah. Well, it would be interesting. Sheila, can you tell us about Katwa and what it did and why you felt it was an important organisation to develop in Australia?
Yes. When I arrived in 1991, I was horrified to discover that women's photographs were on sale basically in the telephone directory, and brothels were legalised. They were legalised in 1984 in the state of Victoria that I was in, whereas in the UK there was a very strong understanding that prostitution was an abuse of women. And in fact, I wrote my first paper on prostitution back in 1979, I think, and obviously in Women Against Violence Against Women we had strong anti-prostitution politics. So discovering that this was seen as okay in Australia, and that in fact there were no feminists opposing prostitution at all, even though it was legalised in many states at that time, it's a big, big shock to me. And I thought, my God, because prostitution is such obvious and vicious oppression of women. It only exists because of the subordination of women, and it is a form of terrible violence against women. So I was very shocked. And as Renate said, I asked Cathy Barry if I could set up a branch of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which we did in 1994. And after that, there was an opposition, and we were, of course, putting in submissions and trying to disagree with the legalization of prostitution and brothels in other states. And we were working on showing the harms of prostitution in Melbourne. For instance, in Melbourne, there was a safety code created between the Prostitutes' Rights Organisation and the government. Basically the government, because it funded the Prostitutes' Rights Organisation, they were the same thing. And they had written this safety code which said it was very important to be careful when using local anaesthetic in the vagina because it could hide serious injury. So if anybody anywhere has any doubt of the pain of prostitution and what it's really like, that it's not some kind of delightful sexual exchange, that shows that. And the rest of the health and safety code, which was for escort work, that is women sent out to meet women in their cars, in their houses, in their hotel, to meet men in hotel rooms and so on. It also said that women had to be ready to, because the man could become violent or it could be a hostage situation, they should be ready to pick up a heavy ashtray and smash their stereo. Remember, this was in the days of stereos, because that would upset them. And they should leave their clothes at the door because they might have to run out of the room, and they should be careful where they put their cars, and so on and so on. So it was very clear that it was about terrible violence, and this was administered by the state, pimp states, as we call them, who set up prostitution to service the male sex right, because men must have access to women enslaved in these terrible circumstances. So yes, being in Katwa with Renate and Cathy and now Megan, who's running Katwa in Melbourne, it was a very, very important action for me, because I wasn't involved in anything else, activist in Australia at that time, particularly apart from my writing. So all the way through, I was working in Canberra with many of my wonderful ex-PhD students and other friends. So yes, it was very, very important for me. And what it meant was that I started going all kinds of places talking around prostitution, about prostitution. 2003, the Swedish government, which had done a good law against prostitution to punish men, invited me to New York, and I was talking on a panel there about the terrible harms of prostitution in Melbourne, this supposedly world's most livable city that is so civilized. And afterwards, I had men and women coming up to me from countries all over the world, saying, thank you so much. I got a standing ovation for saying the actual facts of what was happening. And yet there were feminists there, the vast majority when I first arrived, who thought prostitution was a way of women exercising their choice, should be seen as work, etc. So I worked very hard, Catwa worked very hard to change that. And I think we did change that. I do not think there are many feminists in Australia now who think prostitution is a perfectly nice job for a woman.
Renate, could you tell us a bit more about Spinifex? Spinifex has recorded a lot of this history and made it available to women all over the world and men. And one of the most famous books that you published is Radically Speaking, which you published in the mid-90s. Could you tell us about that book?
Yes, absolutely. And I've got it here to show. I think this is probably the most important book that I have worked on. I'm one of the co-editors with Ann Bellos, who is an anthropologist in Australia. It has 70 contributors. Sheila is one of them. And basically, it's a look at radical feminism. What is radical feminism? And we called it, Radically Speaking, Feminism Reclaimed, because by the mid-90s, postmodernism had already really done a lot of harm, was beginning to do a lot of harm. And there is one section in the book that has, I think, something like 13 contributors that specifically criticize postmodernism. And just for that, it's worth reading the book. We had already published Summer Brodrick's book against postmodernism, Nothing Matters. And from the very beginning, it was very clear to us that Spinifex wanted to publish books that were really going to put these new ideas on the spot, because they were doing absolutely nothing for women. They were only harming women. And we didn't just want to publish, lovely books that, looked pretty, although we do think our books look all really, really were good. And I think Sheila's book, for instance, is a very good looking book. But our books, we always say the name Spinifex comes from a grass, and it looks really pretty, especially when you see it. It's a desert grass, when you see it against the sunset. And so you feel tempted to kind of touch it because it feels so lovely. But it's not at all lovely. It's very prickly. And so we say the Spinifex books, they are beautiful to look at, but they're a bit prickly, and they are not just like, they're not really on the bestseller list, and they're not mainstream books. We are very proud to be outsiders and to talk from the outsider's side. So we have published a lot of books against prostitution, Not for Sale, for instance, which we published in 2004, which is actually still selling. Then Sheila's book. And also I want to mention, we also published Sheila's book, The Lesbian Heresy. We published that in 1993. And that was a very important book, still is a very important book. I got a copy of that one as well. That's another book you should read if you don't know it. It's just really important to have positive books about lesbianism.
Okay, so I've got a question now that comes from Marion Davis.
I greatly appreciate all the work, and I very much value it, that both the academics and the activists among us carry out. But I do find it frustrating, however, to go to feminist events where the default format seems to be that these experts are sitting on a stage and we're sat in the audience facing the front to consume silently their information, their learning. I learnt and shared so much from participating in the 70s and 80s in consciousness raising groups, which were fully egalitarian. Every woman had equal status and could contribute from their experience, from their own understanding. And I would like to know of all the panelists, all the people on your video, all the women, if they think there's any way of returning to that kind of process and bucking the celebrity culture that it seems to be part of, the whole world is submerged in, and it would be nice if feminism could remove itself from that kind of culture. Thank you.
Actually, I agree with my partner here. There's some, and I disagree. I think there are some contexts in which a writer or writers communicating with an audience is a better way by being in a place that can see everybody. What I loved about the Circle was its equality. I have complained when I've been at, or when we've been at events that should have been in a circle, but instead have speakers at the front addressing or a mute audience. So it depends what the event is, what it's for, what the purpose is. I think it's the male way of doing things, to have the speaker at the front and the audience sort of sitting in serried ranks, as I like to call them. It will and should depend upon the nature of what's being communicated. And Sheila speaking to us, me speaking to them, might be appropriate for some purposes. And this book, Trigger Warning, is, I think, one of them. Except look at what we're doing. We're doing this over electronic communications. We're not doing it as open, we're all on the same platform, because it doesn't work. So it's horses for courses. But what we have learnt in recent years is that lots of younger women don't know the feminist way of doing things. And I think Marion's right, that many times we should be using the feminist way, not the men's way.
Yeah, how about you, Sheila? What do you think about that?
In the 1970s, we used to do little sort of jokes for the London newsletter where we'd have a title of a book and then a title of an author, which we thought was suitable. So for Group Dynamics, that was the book title, the author was Rosa Chairs. Right? Who had Plots to Consciousness by Dinah Rod and Drawing Up the Conference Agenda by I. Levy Tout, based on that stuff. So yes, it was very different the way we organized. I mean, all of the ideas that I have started off in groups that we didn't call consciousness raising groups. They were in Wave or other groups where women talked about their experience. We put it together. Our analysis of sexuality and male violence came from all of that. There's no question. And when I moved to Australia, one of the things that I found very difficult was I was on my own. I was, the great teacher who's supposed to spout all of this and write all of this, and I was on my own. I wasn't backed up. I didn't have any groups that I was speaking out of with whom I could test my ideas, and it was a weird experience. I mean, obviously I got used to that, but it was a strange experience. So I think what we need to create now, we can't necessarily create all of those ideas from scratch. There are books with those ideas, I mean, that's the situation we're in at the moment. But we need women to be able to talk about all of the things that are going on now and their lives now, and what the politics of the present are doing to them and their ability to think and act. So we need, yes, consciousness raising groups again. There's no question about that, to talk about all of these things. And that's not really happening. I thought it would. I thought they'd be set up in towns across Britain as they were back in the 1970s. And this would be the basis, because the consciousness raising group is the basis. The friendships are formed there, the support networks. You go out from there and do action based upon your consciousness raising. It didn't happen, and I think it needs to happen. I'm hoping it will start to happen. Women have been very afraid. They've wanted to do things only online and so on. But it absolutely needs to happen. And we do need conferences of which there's much, much, much more discussion. I think it's reasonable to have some speakers to kick off topics because there's a lot of knowledge out there and so on. But we definitely need women being able to talk about how the ideas relate to their own lives and in the political context of now, advancing our understanding of all of this. It's not the same time, but absolutely crucially, women feminists need to be talking together and advancing their analysis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, let's hear from Renate as well. What do you think about that?
I totally agree with what Linda and Sheila just said. I mean, my experience wasn't quite as bad as Sheila's, because when I was teaching women's studies, especially in the tutorials, you know, we always were sitting in a circle, and it was very moving. Some of these young women, you know, we read The Passion for Friends by Janice Raymond, and then they had to give presentations. And for the first time, they actually could imagine that they themselves might be lesbians. I do remember, though, they came to me in my office and they said, where do we go in Melbourne? Where can we meet other lesbians? And it was horrible, because already there were only dreadful bars, as Sheila said, where S&M was, was there. So it was already difficult then. I agree that we should really get together in groups and talk about our lives. But I also think that, just take Sheila's book. I mean, she's lived a very long, productive feminist life. She talks in Trigger Warning about that. She makes the point that she is fortunate that she is actually participating in two waves of the women's liberation movement, because I do think there is a bit of a new wave right now. And so I think it is important that we do have some experts that write books, because only Sheila could have written this book, because she lived it and it's her life. But then what we should do, we should take that book and discuss it. And, you know, there could be book groups, or there could be Zoom thing, you know, that we're doing endless Zooms these days. So we could do Zooms, because I think actually this COVID is not going to go away soon. So we might be stuck with this whole online stuff. But I think the biggest obstacle we have is exactly what I think Sheila said, and is this fixation on online, and that, you know, you glue to your phone or to the computer, to the iPad, and we should meet under a tree and we should talk about our experiences, because that is where the real bonding happens, and that is where also you can have ideas for campaigns and go out and organize. And so, yeah, I mean, all to above, but you could do a book group. And also, I just wanted to say about the discussion of audiobooks. Of course, all our Spinifex books are available as ebooks, if that helps. So, online again, but at least they're also, you can read them on whatever, your Kindle or your iPad or whatever.
When did you first go off down the deep end, Sheila? Did you have deep end inclinations for any other issues before feminism?
Yes, I think I probably did. My first issue really was religion. I became an atheist when I was 12. My really good friend Lynn Humphreys, that I was in my first year at secondary school with, I used to go round on her shoulders and play horsey and things. We were very close. She died of what they called in those days an enlarged heart. And that was it. That was it for God for me. I'd been a good Sunday schooler and all of that. I became an atheist, and in 1960, it was quite difficult to be an atheist at an ordinary school in Britain. You weren't expected to be. And my other friend, Joanna Voss-Spark, who was the daughter of a BBC parliamentary correspondent at that time called Voss-Spark, she said, don't tell anyone. In my family, we're all atheists, but you mustn't tell anyone. So you had to be very secretive. And I wasn't. In classes, I'd object to things and say, I'm not reading poetry with the word God in and things like that. So I was very, very difficult. But otherwise, the sort of things I was involved in at that time, which were not particularly deep end, but they might have been for someone of 14, because I was doing these things quite young. I was in the Young Liberals, of course, talking about abortion and all that kind of stuff. I was in the SPANA, the Society for the Protection of Animals in North Africa, which was about protecting donkeys. I was in an anti-vivisection organisation that sent me magazines with pictures of animals having terrible things done to their eyes to test cosmetics. And I was in the Howard League for Prison Reform. I was campaigning for an end to the death penalty. All of that was at 14. I was also in the Youth Members' Parliament for the Richmond Council and so on and so on. So I was reasonably sort of advanced and politically difficult for my age, I think it's fair to say. So that was the deep ending, I think.
I'll just go over to all three of you for last words. Renata, if you want to say
well,
a couple of things.
At the book launch, normally, you know, you do all these thank yous at the end to everybody who's helped making this book, because it's a long process. It doesn't just happen. And so I just want to acknowledge, you know, my partner, Susan Hawthorne, but also Pauline Hopkins, who was the editor, apart from me, of Sheila's books. And we both had, you know, a good time doing it. So thank you to Pauline. And then the whole team at Spinifex, including our social media person, Caitlin Roper, and our publicist in Sydney. We're actually very decentralized. So we're all throughout Australia. Rachel in Sydney, who we're all trying to, you know, do good publicity for Sheila. And the other thing I want to say is that you can actually buy the Spinifex books wherever you are, especially if you are in England. You don't have to order them from Australia. You can buy them directly, of course, from any good bookshop who should order them in. But our distributor is in Lancaster, and they're called Gazelle Books, and in America they're in Chicago, and they're called Independent Publishers Groups. And if you go on the Spinifex website, that's the Australian Spinifex website, you will find on the homepage it says order, and you find all this information. And yes, of course, there's Amazon, but we don't want to publicize that too much. So I just want to say, you know, big thank yous to everybody who's made this book a reality, but especially to Sheila for writing it. Because, you know, as she says, it's lonely, long, lonely hours that she spends in her study, and it's well worth it, because we can all learn a great deal from what you wrote, Sheila. So thank you.
Great. And we'll get a last word from Linda and then Sheila.
Not much to say, except I really enjoyed Trigger Warning. It took me about 3 days to read it. I was so fascinated by the journey, and I do recommend not only that everyone buys it and reads it, but that we restart a women's liberation movement in every country in the world.
Brilliant. And now last word to Sheila.
Yes, hi everyone. The first thing is I really hope you enjoy the book, and I'm delighted that people think that it's easy to read. You know, I'm trying to move into a whole new way of writing instead of trying to be academic. So crime novels next is what I would like. Also, I'd like to say thank you very much for Renata and Susan for publishing it. It's great to be published by pretty much the only feminist press that's got any kind of certainly radical feminist politics that I think exists in the world at this time, which is terrific. And also, other women, please get writing those autobiographies. We need Linda's out. And we need other radical and revolutionary feminists writing this stuff. We need to get out there and into the history and be available.
You hear that, Marion?
How did your parents react to your early strong opinions?
My mother in particular found it rather challenging. The atheism, first of all, she found very, very difficult indeed. And then what came after the atheism, I don't think she knew about my interest in animals, really. I don't know whether she knew about all of that. The socialism she found extremely difficult, but that was a while later. Yes, the socialism she found difficult, the vegetarianism she found very difficult, the feminism she found very difficult. Oh, I forgot the pacifism. My father was an army officer. When I was 13, 14 years old, I was a very, very strong pacifist and have been all of my life. So that was difficult too. Then eventually I became a lesbian. I can remember my mother saying in my teen years that all these strange opinions came from my school. I must have had teachers at my school. But the fact is, most of the children at my school did not develop these ideas. So I don't think that works. But I do also remember my sister, my middle sister, my two sisters are much older than me, was sent to see if I was reading at night, because I would read under the bedclothes all the time. I read, 90% of the time. So I'd hear her coming up the stairs and I'd have to sort of appear to be asleep, and I would do the special rapid eye movement, under the eyelids to try and persuade her that I was in fact completely asleep. So I think my parents assumed I read, and that was very dangerous for me. And I had these teachers at school that were quite dangerous. I don't know what else I can say really, but yes, I do remember I say in the book that my mother was of a rather conservative disposition in relation to sex. And I have a little anecdote in there about how one evening a friend of mine, a male friend who was just a friend, was sitting in the house that I was in holiday from university, my parents' house. We chatted and chatted and chatted. About 11 o'clock, he went to leave. And as we came out of the door of the lounge, my mother was sitting in tears on the stairs with curlers in her hair, absolutely couldn't bear the fact that we'd been alone in this room and goodness knows what could possibly have gone on. So that was my mother, embarrassing in quite a number of ways. However, it has to be said, I came through.
And just related to that, when, Janice's question was about when you were very young, in your childhood, but in your sort of early 20s, 30s, what was her reaction then as it became clearer that you had these political views?
The situation was I visited my mother because she was living on her own at that time, and I dutifully visited her, but she would talk about anything except what I was doing. Even when I published a book in 1985, had a review in the Times newspaper, she would talk to me about, her nephew's godchild, something or other in South Africa, as long as nothing was discussed about anything that I was doing. When I took her the Spinster Antinomies to show it to her in 1985, she pushed it away and said, I'm not interested in anything like that. So it was quite difficult. I mean, I think there are women who have good relations with their mothers and their parents, particularly now when it's more likely that there might be something in common. But at that time, of course, in my teens, I hoped that I would still wake up to find that I was a foundling. I had been left on my parents' doorstep and they had me by mistake. We had absolutely nothing in common.
Well, that's really interesting. That's good. That's not in the book, so you've only heard that here. The book is really fantastic and you should definitely read it. And there are quite a lot of really good jokes like that, or things I would find funny. I did find funny because I've managed to read it already. It's really very easy to read and fun, and also incredibly informative and some interesting things. So now another question we've had sent in, or we had is, Sheila, there's a time that you call the doldrums. Can you tell us what the doldrums are and what you did during the doldrums?
Yes, I've got a chapter called The Doldrums, which really is about my time in Australia from the early 2000s on till I left in 2015. And that was the lowest point for feminism. I was always trying to remain cheerful. So in 2005, when I wrote Beauty and Misogyny, I put in a hopeful last chapter about how the movement was beginning again. Nothing happened. But I've always done that in all the books I've written to try and encourage. And something actually is happening now, so that's fantastic. So really, it was a very, very low point for feminism. I was having real troubles in Australia with the women's studies, now called gender studies, people who would sort of ignore me if I went to conferences, and it was very lonely. And it got lonelier and lonelier and lonelier. Fortunately, during those years, I was also doing work with the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and I was going to all over the world, to Korea and India and the US and the UN, to talk about prostitution. So it was a fascinating time, but I wasn't doing it out of any kind of a movement, because there really was no kind of a movement. And I talk in the book a lot about what was happening in universities. 2005, my University of Melbourne became a so-called corporation, which meant that it became extremely hostile to feminism. It was all about making money. You had to put in grants to get money that were nothing to do with any kind of decent politics. And so things became more and more and more difficult, and I did become quite lonely in that time. I mean, there was Katwa, and there were some friends, so there was a nucleus, and there were my wonderful PhD students. But otherwise, it just got more and more depressing. I thought it was over. I thought it was all over, really. And then I came to Britain for a couple of radical feminist conferences, the 2012 conference organised by Julia Long. And suddenly I realised things were happening here. Radical feminism was waking up here. There was something to come back to. I'd never considered coming back, and I miss Australia terribly, terribly. But suddenly I realized I needed to come back. There was something to come into.
Did you receive an apology for being deplatformed because you stood your ground recently? So have you been, has anybody apologized to you for deplatforming you? Could you tell us about that, Linda?
I can only say, are you having a laugh? No, of course not. These people who don't really understand, they don't understand politics, and they certainly don't understand the women's liberation movement. They ought to. They ought to have read something, you know, over the last 20, 30 years or so. But I don't know why, but people seem to have been, I'm saying people, as in men and women, seem to have been swept up in this new thing called gender that I just find it extraordinary. But so the answer is no.
Yeah, and so a follow-up question to that is, how about you, Linda? What were you doing in the sort of downtime of feminism? Did you see it as a sort of peak in the 1980s and then going down and then re-emerging now? Do you have that same feeling about it? And what have you been doing?
Well, if I tell you that firstly, I do have a degree and it's in politics, and I got it as a mature student. So I brought I threw out quite a lot of the what do they call it? You know, the theory. But I remained a feminist, and so what was I doing? Well, I tell you, one of the really difficult things was I had a relationship with a woman who subsequently died, but she had cancer, cervical cancer. And it has been one of the things that I keep thinking, do I hate this trans politics because CJ had cancer and they'll never have that? And the answer is no, but she was a woman, and they aren't. They just claim to be women through a politics for a rationale that it just doesn't make any sense to me. Not my lived experience of being a woman, being a girl, being denied lots of things. That was then. And I know things have changed because feminists fought for that change. But in the world, women are still being murdered because they're women, raped. I mean, there's paid less. That's what here, or Singapore, or the United States of America. All of those things are happening. So I remained a feminist, and I did think that feminism, as I knew it, would come back. I did think it would. I don't know. It wasn't dead. It had been suffocated, but it wasn't dead, and I'm delighted. Sheila's back. and I'm talking about back being able to write as a feminist, not just back in the UK. She could be, as I'm sure, as important and significant in Australia, when and if the circumstances are right.
Linda, would you please say something about feminism and racism over the years? What would you wish for the women's movement internally towards the world and towards the world regarding racism?
Well, what I did say and what I have been saying is the need to recognise racism as a phenomena equal to, similar to sexism. We learn it and we have to unlearn it. I must say, on a personal level, I use the term race for a long time, and suddenly, I think at some point in 2006, I tweaked it, as it were. In my head, something made me recognise that race is as much a man-made notion as gender is. That's what happened then, and I've been insistent upon not recognising race and certainly not recognising gender. There's not a competition as to which is the worst. I've been arguing those points, and I don't think that lots of trans like me. And do you know what? I don't think I care.
After reading The Lesbian Revolution, which is one of Sheila's books, I wanted to know more about the distinction between radical feminism and revolutionary feminism. And she could see that you talk about that in your book, in this book, Trigger Warning, but could you tell us something about that, Sheila? And then we'll go to Linda.
Yes. I was in the early 1970s a socialist feminist. In the mid 1970s, I was in a socialist feminist group in London, and I reacted against the socialist feminism because it was all about women and categories that were important to men. So it would be women and Ireland, women and war, women and this. It was never women and men. Men were never seen as the problem, and there was never seen to be any contradiction between women and men. That's how socialist feminism was at that time. And so I wrote a paper in 1976 called The Need for Revolutionary Feminism, 1977. And I delivered this paper at a women's liberation conference. And I didn't mean to set up a tendency. I just said we need a revolutionary feminism. I came from the left. My theory came from the left. I said in that paper that we needed to analyze the relations between women and men in terms of a class struggle. We needed to understand where men got their power from, how they operated, what were their centers of power, and how could we attack them. So, and I wrote that for women, the main reason that we were oppressed and through which we were oppressed was our bodies and our reproductive potential. And lots of women came to that workshop and were very, very enthusiastic about the paper I'd written. And they wanted to form a tendency, as it was called in those days. And they did. And in fact, they said, we want to carry you out on our crossed arms. And I said, no, don't be silly. And I was wearing at the time, as I always say, heterosexual dungarees, because I was still heterosexual, which were rather loose, which were rather tight ones, rather than the loose ones that lesbians would have been wearing. So I found that a tendency had been created. And then some of those women held a meeting saying, could you be a revolutionary feminist heterosexual? And so I went to that meeting and I said I completely agreed with them. And I asked my boyfriend of the time and another young man from Socialist Workers' Party who were living in my flat to move out. And over a little while, I became a lesbian. So the reason why radical and revolutionary feminism were different as I saw it was I didn't really understand radical feminism, but I thought it was about changing sex roles in some way. What I wanted to do was know what the centre of men's power was and attack it. So it was a much more sort of structural analysis. Also, revolutionary feminists very quickly became very much involved in fighting around sexuality and male violence, whereas radical feminists weren't so much involved in doing that. And very quickly, of course, it became clear that revolutionary feminists either already were or swiftly became lesbians. So I would say revolutionary feminists were the sort of radical front of radical feminism, if you like. That changed over the years because in the 1990s, when even radical feminism was in trouble, women didn't really want to call themselves revolutionary feminists anymore. I think I stopped sometime in the late 90s doing so because it was no longer understood. And so it collapsed into radical feminism.
I think what Sheila's described is very close to my own experience, except that I wasn't a feminist of any kind up until 1970, let me just try to remember, the late 70s. I recognized the different, I don't know how, I soon became a revolutionary feminist. When I saw and heard the critique that other feminists were putting forward, the thing that came closest to my understanding of change and understanding of oppression was called revolutionary feminism. And I continued to call myself a revolutionary feminist until very recently, when I realized that they'd had to rename to call themselves radical feminists again. And I don't know, for me, it doesn't care. I don't care a great deal of what the names are. It's the underlying ideology, thought, process that I care about. So I'm not desperately, I don't refuse to discuss feminist politics with somebody who doesn't identify in the same way as I do. And that's slightly different. I do remember, I suspect Sheila may remember as well, some of the arguments we had with sock femmes. There was a conference that they were, what was it called? I remember where it was. I can't remember the name. Somewhere in central London, a university, and we had words. I think it would be fair to say we had words with these socialist feminists who had no real viable critique of men's power and women's power and women's agency. They hadn't. It's quite funny now. I bump into some of them, and they've come to our view, which is rather nice and inevitable.
About being or becoming a lesbian, whether it's choice. So can you, how does this work, this thing of choosing to become a lesbian? And also, is that related to political lesbianism?
Well, at the moment, we are in very, very conservative times where biology is assumed to be the reason for absolutely everything, which is why we have men saying that they've got, essences of gender, and gender is seen as somehow essential and something that everybody has, whereas of course none of us have genders, and gender is what feminists are trying to get rid of. So gender is seen as biological now, sexuality is largely seen as biological now. This was very different in the 1970s. They were revolutionary times. Sociologists, anthropologists had taught us that these things were actually socially constructed, certainly gender was. And the next move along the line was to say that actually sexuality was socially constructed as well. If we don't see sexuality as socially constructed, that means we see heterosexuality as somehow natural. And of course, heterosexuality, we understood, and I understood now, to be a political institution. in order that men can actually control women and women's reproduction and have sexual access and access to all the forms of labor that women do for free in the home, domestic labor, emotional labor, and so on and so on, they need to have heterosexuality as an institution through which that can be extracted. Therefore, they have to make heterosexuality compulsory, and it pretty much is compulsory. One of the reasons you can see it is so now is the disappearing of lesbianism. Lesbians are so terrified of being lesbians now, they're calling themselves anything in the world, you know, blue-haired, binary, non-binary, goodness knows what's, queer, etc., anything but lesbian, because it's now really not acceptable to be a lesbian. That's been a huge advance of compulsory heterosexuality in a way in this time. So if you don't see sexuality as socially constructed, that means heterosexual is natural rather than enforced upon us and cannot change. Thousands and thousands and thousands of us did change, and we became lesbians, and lesbians for the rest of our lives. So really the revolutionary position has to be to say that women can change, because we can. We can make wonderful lives for ourselves where we're not servicing men and having our labor extracted for them, where we can love women and have a marvelous time. Women have to be given the possibility of getting out. And if you say women can't be lesbians, then you are imprisoning women in that institution. So it's a very, very, very anti-revolutionary position.
Thank you. How about you, Linda? What's your thoughts on this? Did you see it as a choice, becoming a lesbian, or how did that work?
I had a very strange process. It was from being a sort of married woman with 2 children, going to university and having a husband who I serviced in every sense. I fell in love with a woman, a lesbian, and it made me rethink everything. Some of the questions to myself was, how come it had never occurred to me to love a woman? Now, the racism of the world was part of that lesbians were white, and I had a very strong black awareness. It took me, I think, about 3 weeks to recognize compulsory heterosexuality. I began to see the ideology of gender, and I soon left. Well, in fact, I wanted the man that I had married and the father of my children to leave our home. He wouldn't, and I ended up having to leave, especially because women's spaces wouldn't accept my son, and I wasn't prepared to leave. My children were very young at the time, 5 and 3. So I became a lesbian. I have remained a lesbian, and it was a political act. And I love women. I didn't sleep with women or call myself a lesbian for pure politics. But it was a function of politics that let me see possibility. It is about the word race, and I think I said it earlier, but I really want to be very clear about this. I think that the notion of races is historical. It is similar to the notion of gender. There is, without doubt, racism. I and every black, or not just black, I mean, Jews were subject to racism. Racism is a man-made notion to justify the power that they have over everybody else. The same men who both developed and reinforced this ideology were doing exactly the same on gender. So I'm not questioning the existence of racism. I am questioning the existence of races. There is but one race. It's called the human race.
Why should women read, trigger warning, My Lesbian Feminist Life by Sheila Jeffries? Why would we bother to read it? Can I have Sheila first?
Yes, well, I'm hoping that the book will be really interesting to a whole new generation of feminists, some of whom are not young, and many of whom are, because it will let them know what we had, what it was like to go through it as a woman and undertake incredible change, because I undertook incredible change in myself, which is not usually seen these days. Often feminism is seen as something out there that you work towards, rather than transforming who you are, getting rid of the makeup, becoming a lesbian, etc., etc. So I'm hoping that it will be really helpful to young women in that way.
Well, it's, I think, wonderful. I read it very quickly because I couldn't wait to kind of see what happened. I knew the outline because, as I say, Sheila and I had known each other, but some of the detail is very important. The being a girl child, it should ring bells for many women, and I think it's an extremely good read. It's her story, and it also, I think, rings bells for many of us. It's a good story, and it's the other important thing is Sheila's academic books are important. I think it's useful to know who has written them, and I think Trigger Warning gives us a very good image of the person who, well, is sitting in a technical sense beside us all today. So I want to thank Sheila for writing the blasted book.